Part of OPPD's plan to go carbon neutral by 2050 is making its way to the Turtle Creek Station tonight.
Now, 6 News' Brent Weber has an update on the long haul through the streets of Sarpy County.
What weighs more than the Statue of Liberty is 57 times heavier than an African elephant, longer than Cinderella's castle is tall, and is about the length of 2 blue whales. Oh, and it was seen rolling with an escort along the highway in Sarpy County tonight.
It's a Siemens combustion turbine that came all the way from rail from North Carolina. It'll be in upwards of close to 800,000 pounds, dual lanes. It's in 2 tractor trailers. It will push-pull setup. It'll be quite heavy. A
landmark journey for the last big piece to the Omaha Public Power District's Turtle Creek Station at 168th and Fairview in Papillion.
This natural gas-fired turbine will power our Turtle Creek generating station, which will be a balancing station, part of our Power with Purpose project. With Power with Purpose, we're installing 2 natural gas-fired power stations, Standing Bear Lake and Turtle Creek Station. And also, we're installing anywhere between 450 and 600 megawatts of solar power throughout the Omaha Public Power District service territory.
At about 10 miles an hour, the journey from rail yard to site takes about 5 hours. Andy's vehicle is part of a motorized entourage befitting something, well, powerful.
We'll be escorted by the Nebraska State Patrol, Nebraska Department of Transportation, the Sarpy County Sheriff's Office tonight. There'll be lots of flashing lights. It'll be moving quite slowly, and we ask anyone that comes along to keep their distance. It's pretty cool, but to keep the passerbys and ourselves safe, we need to make sure we observe all the traffic rules.
Turtle Creek and Standing Bear will be balancing stations to assure that whatever's going on in the growing district, there should be no gap in power.
Their intent is to go beyond just summer peaking. They're there to back up the grid when the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, any other disturbances we might have.
We're told construction at both stations is on time for them to be part of the power grid starting in the first quarter of 2024. On your side in Sarpy County, Brent Weber, 6 News.